India may be winning cricket, but India is losing credibility. Until recently, India was shining, or so it seemed. It became the fifth largest economy in terms of GDP, surpassing the United Kingdom. It claims to have become the fourth country to land in Moon recently in July. India's advancement in IT and science and technology cannot be denied. In September, India's glitter was at its peak when it hosted the G20 summit. And then it all started falling apart. They say all that glitters is not gold. The question is that the India being portrayed on the media, was it real or just a hologram? Today, India is becoming synonymous with terrorism, genocide, and racial killing. Various ethnicities in India have been crying for decades to get the world's attention on Indian atrocities, which have peaked under the Modi regime. The neighboring countries have piles of evidence against Indian interference. Remember Kulbhushan Yadav, a serving Indian military officer who was caught red handed in Pakistan for espionage. But the world ignored, especially the West, the so called champions of human rights and leaders of the world. And why? Because they needed India on their side against the so called self created menace of China. And so they ignored until India started biting the hands that were feeding it. And international media, after a shameless silence covering India's crimes, could hide it no more. On 18 September, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, accused Indian government of killing a Canadian citizen, Hardeep Singh Nijjar, on Canadian soil. The Anglophones had no choice but to stand with Canada and demanded India to cooperate in the investigation. The US ambassador confirmed that shared intelligence between the Five Eyes partners informed the Canadian Prime Minister of the involvement of Indian state agents in the murder of Niger. India made matters worse by accusing Trudeau instead of cooperating in the investigations. Both the countries have expelled each other's diplomats since the incident. Last month, Qatar, another friend of India, handed over death sentence to 8 Indian naval officers on charges of espionage, further exposing India's criminal interference in other countries. On 22nd October, Nikkei Asia raised an interesting question: why New Delhi struggles to win friends and influence neighbors. It further states that Maldives, which has traditionally remained under Indian influence, exposes India's backfiring China containment strategy. After Muhammad Muizzu won presidential elections in Maldives on an India out drumbeat, beating a pro India incumbent. Just a week back, Qatar expelled an Indian journalist with his family for misreporting on the death sentence. China has also recently expelled Indian journalists from its soil on charges of responding to India's handling of Chinese journalists. Another serious blow to the India's international credibility occurred in the aftermath of the Palestine crisis. India is perhaps the only country outside the West which has openly supported Israel's atrocities. And even against its own tradition, in the General Assembly, it has abstained from voting in favor of ceasefire. This further exposes India's internal fissures because majority of its population, like elsewhere in the world, is protesting in favor of the Palestinians, which is evident from mass protests in all major cities of India. Thus, it is becoming very clear that Modi's government does not represent the opinions and aspirations of common Indian. Modi's government is not only getting isolated internationally in the world, it is also becoming more and more disconnected from its own people. India is the country with most number of secessionist movements, active secessionist movements in the world. Kashmir remains the longest remaining unresolved uh, issue on the United Nations agenda. Massacres of Muslims throughout India is a routine under the RSS Modi government. But now it has spread to all ethnicities in India. As I speak, genocide of Christians is also going on in the Indian state of Manipur under the watchful eyes of the state. Examples are innumerable and it is pulling the Indian society apart. One must admit that there is no dearth of sane voices within India, even from the Hindus. But at present, it is the zealotry and radicalism which is ruling the roost in the country. Modi's India is trying to take off with only the business class, leaving the economy class buried under the ground. That's not possible. And this is a recipe for implosion within India. India has no threat from the outside, it is only vulnerable from within. India must realize that if it has to take off, it can only take off with all passengers on board. No country can become a world power by ignoring a large portion of its population. No country can prosper alone in this world. India needs to reconcile with its policy of exclusivism. India needs to stand with goodness and righteousness.